Glasgow. The postcard is museums and music halls. The truth carries a scar. For nearly 2 centuries, one weapon ruled these streets: the blade. Razor crews, stairwell ambushes, names carved into history with steel. The toll? More wounds than anywhere else in Britain, so brutal that even in the 2000s, global watchdogs called Scotland one of the bloodiest in the West, and Glasgow the murder capital of Europe. What turned this city so dangerous, and how deep does the fear run? Let's take a look. Imagine Glasgow of the 1920s, packed so full with people it became Britain's most overcrowded city. Here the industries were dying out and the promise of prosperity had turned to grime. The slum neighborhoods swelled with desperate men and women, and from this desperation, violent street gangs emerged. By some counts, Glasgow had 6 times as many gangs as any other city in the UK. In those narrow streets and dark alleys, a hard man mentality was born and bred. Rival clans fought for every scrap of turf and pride, and the knife was the weapon of choice. Historian Douglas Skelton explains it plainly. The gangs formed as soon as the slums did. The earliest recorded gang was the so-called penny mob from the 19th century, so named because each member paid a penny levy towards each other's fines. As Glasgow slid into the 20th century, even more gangs popped up, all with colourful nicknames. One gang took to slashing their own faces so badly that the wounds turned bright red. Instead of hiding their scars, they wore them proudly and came to be known as the Redskins. Violence became a twisted badge of honour, but it wasn't just poverty that drew blood in Glasgow. In the late 1800s, a tide of Irish immigrants arrived on Clydeside, fleeing famine at home. They stayed in cramped tenements in places like the Gorbals in the south, Carlton in the east, and Royston, also known as Garngad, near the north banks of the Clyde. These newcomers were mostly Catholic in a city that was fiercely Protestant, and a fierce sectarian divide took root. Many Glaswegians of the era wrongly feared these immigrants would steal their jobs and change their way of life. Catholics and Protestants ended up living in tightly packed enclaves, separated only by a street or a wall. This was a recipe for violence. You have to remember, Glasgow was seen as a Protestant city. Indeed, Scotland was predominantly Protestant at the time, so the arrival of Irish Catholics triggered intense suspicion. Scottish Protestants started to see all the new Irish arrivals as incomers, who were somehow less than human, historian Skelton tells us. Meanwhile, the Irish, desperate to survive and facing prejudice, stuck together in small neighbourhoods. They formed their own communities in places like Gorbals, Carlton, Maryhill, and Bridgeton, searching for safety in numbers. This sectarian mistrust flared up quickly. One area especially became a powder keg: Bridgeton, often called Brigton by locals. This was a Protestant neighbourhood nestled right next to Catholic districts. It was here that one of Glasgow's most infamous gangs would be born. They took their name from a symbol of Protestant triumph, King William of Orange, often called King Billy, the 17th century monarch who had annexed Northern Ireland and reinforced Protestant rule. These men called themselves the Billy Boys. Who were the Billy Boys? Legend has it they formed in 1924 by one fiery young Protestant, William Fullerton. As an 18-year-old lad, Fullerton had made the mistake of celebrating after a football match with a Celtic Catholic youth team. A Rangers player grabbed a hammer and struck Fullerton over the head. Vowing revenge, Fullerton gathered about 40 men and declared they would be scarier and more brutal than any gang that dared attack them. He called them the Brigton Boys, and soon they were marching down the street in proud uniforms, chanting songs of King Billy and playing a big bass drum in parades. To the Billy Boys, violence wasn't a shame, it was a kind of patriotism. They saw themselves as defenders of the Protestant nation, like a private army on the streets. History expert Andrew Davis points out that this gang was strangely organized. It was not a ragtag mob, but a paramilitary crew. The members paid subscriptions like a club fee. Those dues were kept in a bank fund to pay any members legal fines if they got arrested. When a man was released from jail, the gang would make sure he had boots and clothes waiting. They even offered themselves as mercenaries for politicians who needed a brawl broken up. For example, smashing up Communist Party meetings to keep protesters in line. "You have to understand," said Davis. "The Billy Boys marched in the streets wearing uniform. They had sections of about 40 men, each section with its own captain, reporting up to Fullerton at the top. They walked around with drums and flutes, waving flags and singing. They really saw themselves as part of the establishment. After all, the establishment was Protestant too. They were the self-appointed army of the East End." The gang's bravado often hid the deadly reality. Members would swagger around with knives or hatchets hidden under their orange sashes. They looked glamorous in parades, but off the parade route, they were feared thugs who preyed on Catholics and the weak alike. It's one thing to hear about a gang, and another entirely to witness their violence. Glasgow's darkest day came on a chilly March afternoon in 1934 at the old Brigton Cross railway station. A group of about 500 Rangers supporters, decked out in blue scarves and rosettes, had gathered on the platform. They were waiting for a train that would take them to Ibrox, Rangers' home stadium. All around, the air buzzed with sectarian chants against their rivals, the Celtic Papists. At the same time, in a neighbouring station, another train rolled in from Paisley carrying hundreds of Celtic supporters. When the Celtic fans stepped off the train and spotted the Rangers mob on the platform, each side started hurling the worst insults at the other. The air crackled with anger. Sectarian slurs, threats, nasty words flew back and forth. Suddenly, in the middle of this chaos, one of the Billy Boys decided to make history. A big, menacing man named John Tricare, also known as John Tracare, stepped forward from among the Rangers fans. With a switchblade razor in hand, he lunged at the first Catholic supporter he could reach. That man, Johnny McVeigh, had to shield his face to stop the razor slashing open his cheek. McVeigh's companion cursed and tried to fight back, but Tricare turned on him too, punching him hard. Train guards and nearby police officers scrambled to break up the melee. Tricare was wrestled down and slammed to the ground. He screamed, "Move the train, move it now." But it was already too late. The attack had been brutal and swift. No one in Glasgow had ever seen anything quite like this, a planned sectarian ambush in broad daylight. It became known simply as the Bridgeton Station riot. The aftermath sent shockwaves through the city. Tricare was arrested and charged with assault and riot. On the day of his trial, the courtroom was packed. People expected, given the old bias in Scottish courts, that a Protestant thug would get off lightly. But something surprising happened. Judge Andrew Quayle sentenced Tricare to 4 years in prison. This was unusually harsh for a non-fatal assault at that time, and even more unusually harsh for a former policeman. Tricare had been a police constable on leave. The public reaction was explosive. Tens of thousands signed petitions asking the Scottish Secretary of State to review Tricare's sentence, arguing it was far too severe. But the sentence stood. For many Catholics, this was the first time they had felt the law treated them equally. That one incident at the station changed everything. The authorities suddenly realized Glasgow's sectarian gangs weren't just a local nuisance, they were a terrifying threat to public order. The police, under new leadership, decided to fight fire with fire. This is where Percy Sillitoe comes in, a police chief from England who arrived in Glasgow determined to bust the gangs. He famously recruited 30 Highlanders, the Glasgow Cossacks, gave them batons and basic training, and sent them out to patrol the city's roughest areas. The old find 'em and let 'em go approach wasn't working anymore. These new officers were told to batter the gangs into submission if needed. By 1935, the showdown was on. The Billy Boys weren't subtle. They marched through Orange Order parades through the streets of Bridgeton and beyond, marching behind their beloved big drum. They'd even set up a flautist and pipe band fully decked in uniform. These parades would often provoke Catholic gangs who lurked in the shadows. On one sunny afternoon on Norman Street, the Billy Boys were parading as usual in the East End when hidden police saw their chance. Sillitoe's men waited in the side streets until the marchers and their enraged Catholic rivals had clashed and exhausted themselves. Then, at the signal, the baton charge began. Mounted police galloped out of nearby stables. Men with truncheons sprung from vans. The result was carnage. Police swept into the melee with ferocity. Men were knocked to the ground, horses reared into the fray. Clubs rained down on anyone identified as a gang member. According to Sillitoe himself, almost every Billy Boy was laid out, all except one drummer who hid inside his huge bass drum until the dust settled. After that day, the gang's spell was broken. Glasgow's street army was no match for an organized police assault. The Billy Boys were never as powerful again. Their patriarch, Billy Fullerton, would later be arrested and imprisoned. When his cell was searched, police found £600 stashed, a fortune at the time, which Fullerton said was bankrolled by paying gang members. That money was seized and used for legal fees, effectively bankrupting the gang's operations. Fullerton got out of prison eventually, but by then, his ambitions had taken a darker turn. He became involved in fringe right-wing politics, forming a local branch of Mosley's British Union of Fascists, and later even founding a Glasgow chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Yes, the American racist group. Under that banner he spewed anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic and racist hate. He died penniless in 1962, but by then, legend had grown around him. The funeral for the man who launched the Billy Boys saw around 1,000 mourners dressed in orange follow his coffin from Bridgeton Cross to a cemetery in the northeast of the city. Even in death he was given the grand send-off of a warlord, though today, his grave remains unmarked. A final grim epitaph to a lifetime of violence. Yet the ghosts of the Billy Boys live on. The sectarian divide they epitomized has faded somewhat, but their spirit of street violence simply adapted. In modern Glasgow, it's not often called Billy Boys anymore, but the city's underworld remains brutal in its own way. Turf wars, drug gangs, and family feuds have taken up the mantle. The blade still speaks. To grasp how Glasgow's old culture of violence has mutated, consider one horrific incident from 2010 in Maryhill, a district in the city's northwest. It involved two supposedly allied families, the Malavins and the Currans, both attached to the Maryhill fleet gangs in that area. The trouble began in the most absurd way, a bottle of cheap fortified wine. One night, a young member of the Malavin family caught a friend of his, called Paul Brown, with his drink. In a cruel joke, the Malavin dumped urine into that bottle and gave it back. When the friend took a gulp, he spat it out in disgust. An insult? Yes, but not one life should hinge on. Yet Zach Malavin didn't take it as a joke. Enraged by the prank, Zach stabbed the friend Brown. He then sped off, even swerving to try to run down Andrew Curran, father of one of the Malavin's enemies. Naturally, this put both families on high alert. The Malavins were furious, the Currans were enraged. Tensions simmered. It could have been settled by a street brawl, or maybe nothing at all, if both sides had accepted it as a stupid night's silliness. But instead, Andrew Curran, a father determined to protect his son's honor, decided to meet the Malavins. He called for a parley in Maryhill Park. It was meant to be a peaceful discussion. After all, in Glasgow, it is actually tradition to sort out such disputes, a half and half, face to face, fists only, no weapons. They call it a square go. But someone somewhere had other ideas. When the Currans showed up in the park on the evening of April 16, 2010, they had their fists ready for a fight. The Malavins, however, had other plans. They came armed with a machete, a crossbow, and a shotgun hidden in the bushes. What followed was a scene of brutality that shook the community. The Malavin brothers, Angus and Zach, along with an associate, Stephen Sully, ambushed the unarmed Currans and their friends. Andrew Curran Sr., father of the 18-year-old Andrew Jr., was quickly cornered. The Malavins slashed him across the stomach and chopped deep into his neck with the machete, bits of bottle glass tearing skin even further. He collapsed, bleeding furiously, clutching his own throat. James McGregor, a loyal friend of the Currans, rushed to help and was met with equal savagery. James was hit in the face with a bullet from the crossbow, which later exploded his cheek. He fell, convulsing, the arrow piercing his chest. Young Andrew Jr. had fled the scene earlier, but returned in shock. He found his father dead, his friend James barely hanging on to consciousness. It was a massacre, not a fight. The police and ambulances arrived minutes later, but it was too late. Andrew Curran Sr. died that night in a Glasgow hospital. James McGregor survived, but was left forever disfigured and scarred by bullet and blade. The city was stunned. How could a trivial prank escalate to cold-blooded murder? Detectives quickly tied the crime to the Malavin family. In the following trial at the High Court in Glasgow, the evidence was damning. Angus and Zach Malavin, despite the judge noting how young Zach was, were found guilty of murder. Angus got 17 years, Zach 18. Stephen Sully was found guilty of a lesser charge, culpable homicide, meaning manslaughter, and sentenced to 7 years. All three were also convicted of the separate attack on James McGregor. You might think justice being served would calm things down, but in Glasgow's code, even guilty verdicts can trigger revenge. 4 hours after the sentence was read, armed men let loose a shotgun blast into the window of the Curran home in Maryhill, narrowly missing Andrew Curran Jr. Then, only a month later, Andrew Jr. himself was attacked on a nearby street, Rothers Drive, stabbed multiple times in the head with a machete. He survived, but again it was clear, the feud was far from over. The ripple effect of this one night's terror reached deep. In small communities, everyone knew who did it, but coming forward was dangerous. The police estimated that just the stabbings and shooting from gang violence in Glasgow had put more than 2,000 bed days worth of patients in hospital in 1 year. That's like 6 full hospital wards filled around the clock, all victims of blades. We asked Dr. Christine Good, an oral surgeon at the Southern General Hospital, what it's like treating these injuries. She looked exhausted, but grimly determined as she described the wounds. Usually young men, sometimes teenagers, one side of their face torn apart from the mouth up to the cheek or eye. We call that a Glasgow smile, because it's like they've been slashed to create a permanent grin. It's devastating because you can't really sew that up neatly. Sometimes they strap 2 razor blades together on a toothbrush to slash someone's cheek. We end up having to remove bits of tissue to repair it, leaving massive scars. It's terrible to look at. Dr. Good added quietly, many of these scars end up being a mark of pride for them. I've had guys lie in bed as I stitch them, downplaying it. Doc, no worries, it looks fine. And I see their friends come visit, all with big scars too. They act like trophies. It's like an old dueling scar, but twisted. They think it makes them look tougher. I had one lad who said exactly that. He said, "We done the old Zorro move, Mark. It's like dueling scars from years ago, ain't it?" It was chilling. It's truly a bitter irony. These wounds are meant to maim and humiliate, yet they have become badges of honor among some gangs. We wear scars like medals, the young patient shrugged to Dr. Good. So how do people try to fight back against this cycle? For decades, traditional policing struggled. Witnesses feared gangs, families stayed silent. You can't just haul gang members off to jail without evidence, and proving anything was almost impossible in tight-knit communities. One community member told us that in those neighborhoods, if you picked up the phone to call the police, you yourself became a target. You'd call 999, they'd see who rang, and your kids and relatives would be in danger. It's safer to deal with it yourself, they said. But finally, someone had a new idea. In 2008, the Strathclyde Violence Reduction Unit, VRU, was founded, a bold experiment aimed not just at punishment, but at change. The VRU's director, who asked not to be named on the record, came up with an astonishing plan. Gather all the gang members together in one room and talk to them. Here's what happened. The police and local courts organized a meeting at the sheriff's court. In the morning, 120 youth gang-affiliated men were brought in. In the afternoon, another 100. Rival gangs, all in the same place. You'd think violence would explode right there, but everyone was told to strip off weapons and cell phones at the door. Under stern warning, no trouble was allowed. The sheriff stepped forward and fixed them with a hard stare, offering no comfort. He flipped through a photo album of grainy CCTV stills and mugshots showing gang members in the act. Stabbings, shootings, street fights. Then declared that he knew exactly who they were, where they lived, and what they had done. He warned that some believed themselves invisible, and made clear he could, if he chose, send officers to knock on every door on his list and drag them off the street. But he emphasized he was not there to do that in that moment. Instead, he wanted them to decide whether they would choose a different path. He made it clear, change, or continue at your peril. Then, to drive it home, the VRU brought in graphic evidence. They put movies on the screen, not entertainment films, but nightmare footage of victims being rushed into Glasgow hospitals, their bodies ripped open by shrapnel or razor. The room fell silent except for gasps and the beeps of heart monitors on video. Many of the young gangsters sat with their eyes fixed on the door, their bravado shattered by the sight. Doctors and nurses followed next. Surgeons from Glasgow displayed photographs of their patients' injuries, scars and wounds so severe that faces were left mutilated, with jaws exposed and cheeks tore open to the bone. A police medic addressed the crowd, explaining that the images on the screens represented the grim reality of the violence they inflicted on one another. Every day, he said, he was forced to tell families that their sons were either dead or left with permanent brain damage, and the look on the parents' faces was something he would never forget. And then came the hardest moment. A mother of one of the gang victims stood up. She had attended court every day, powerless, as she watched her own son's murderers be sentenced. Tearfully, she addressed the room. "You boys," she said, pointing at them, "you might not care about yourselves or your future, but look at what you do to our families. My son was 16. He was kneecapped in a gang fight and died in front of me." The room was deadly quiet. Mothers in the audience had been muttering before, but now, not a sound. The tears in her eyes shot darts of pain through everyone. "He fell face first in the dirt that night. I saw him die. And what were his killers doing? Laughing about how tough they were." The room fell completely silent. Many of the young men sat motionless, the same men who had entered that courtroom hardened and defiant, now unable to lift their heads. In that moment, the weight of family, the one thing they all understood, hit them harder than any sentence ever could. A grieving mother stood before them, her voice breaking as she spoke of entering her son's room every day, clutching his bedspread and crying for the life that had been taken. Her words left no doubt about the depth of her pain and the reality of what they had done. The police and judges ended the meeting by presenting the young men with a choice. The Violence Reduction Unit offered mentoring, training, therapy, and even limited financial assistance, but only if the youths willingly accepted it. No one was forced into the program. According to the unit's director, these young men had never truly been given a choice before. Their gangs had dictated every move under threat of violence. For the first time, they were offered a way out, a chance to decide whether they wanted to continue living in chaos or build something better. To the surprise of many, a number of them admitted they never wanted to witness another death like the ones they had seen. Some did take the offer, others walked out silently. The first meetings were tense and risky. What if fights broke out in the court hall? But none did. The dignity of those mothers, the authority of the sheriff, the horror of the videos, it all hit home. The results have been nothing short of remarkable. Since 2008, nearly 500 gang-involved individuals have signed up with Glasgow's violence reduction program. Officials report that violent crime has plummeted, gang-related violence is down by almost half, weapons possession crimes down by 85%, and involvement in gang fights down by 73%. Even knife carrying by Glasgow youth has dropped drastically. Suddenly, the city that was Europe's murder capital is no longer at the top of that grim league. Let's be clear, Glasgow's scars are still there. If you stroll through certain streets after dark, you might still feel the tension in the air. But neighborhoods that were once no-go zones have changed. Government reports show homicides have fallen by about 60% in the past decade. There are now even bright pink food trucks run by former gang members mentoring young people, a sign of how far this city has come. This transformation didn't happen by luck, it was deliberate. Policymakers in Glasgow took the lessons from doctors, from community activists, even from the old-school choose violence thinkers of Chicago and Boston, and turned them into a Glasgow model. They never abandoned the police either. Stop and search is still strong, and stiff sentences for knife crimes have stayed on the books. But the emphasis is on stopping violence before it starts, as if it were a disease. The change in Glasgow is astonishing to see. In 2005, the WHO had a figure: 83 homicides in the Glasgow area in 1 year, the highest in Western Europe at the time. Now, it's down to a fraction of that, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a single district in Glasgow where tourists are warned not to go. Even the local Justice Secretary recently said, "There's not a place in Glasgow I wouldn't go now," speaking of his own childhood fears of certain streets. To return to our title, the deadly power of Glasgow's most feared gang, we see that this power was terrifying indeed. It could turn a packed station into a scene of terror, or a quiet park meeting into an execution. It could scar faces and families for generations, but every bit of that power was man-made. It was built from prejudice, poverty, and bad choices, not from fate. So, can it be broken? The Glasgow experience suggests it can. When every gang member heard a dying mother's words, when every bullet wound image was flashed on a courtroom screen, the myth of gang invincibility started to crumble. Some young men got scared enough or hopeful enough to walk away from the razor, Glasgow's darkest chapters are far from over, but they are no longer written in blood alone. The question we must ask ourselves is this: will the kids of Glasgow grow up without inheriting their parents' grudges and scars? Or will history repeat in another corner under another name? For those watching, perhaps ask yourself, do you believe a city born in violence can really change its fate? Are gangs truly defeated when former enemies share a pink t-shirt? The streets of Glasgow might not answer yet, but after so many brutal scenes, maybe the only surprise now is that hope has a chance to shine. What do you think? Will Glasgow ever fully banish its blade? Let us know in the comments below. Remember, if even one mother's plea could shift the hearts of hardened thugs, then maybe, just maybe, there's a future beyond the scars. Stay safe, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments down below.